The bells of Karakorum did not toll, they screamed in fire. On the steppes beyond the Oxus, where the wind carried the scent of sage and distant snow, a monastery burned. The Mongol banners, black as midnight against the dawn, moved like thunderclouds across the grassland. Inside crumbling walls of mud and stone, 24 virgins, daughters of nobles, sworn to God since childhood, waited behind wooden gates that would not hold. They prayed beneath icons painted in gold leaf, their faces turned toward saints whose eyes seemed to weep in the flickering candlelight. Outside, hoofbeats shook the earth like distant thunder growing closer. Sister Seraphina, eldest among them, stood before the altar. Her hands trembled as she clutched a silver crucifix that had survived 3 generations. Her voice was steady when she spoke. If they breached the gates, she whispered to the women kneeling behind her, keep your vows inside your hearts that they cannot take. But she was wrong. The Mongols did not come for land alone. They came to erase memory itself, to crush not just bodies, but the very soul of resistance. What happened next would echo across centuries in whispers, in ruins, in bloodstained chronicles that historians would later try to burn. If you're drawn to documented records from the Mongol conquests, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us uncover more of the accounts buried in archives, from missionary letters to Persian manuscripts. Now, back to the story. The monastery of St. Catherine stood in the Altai foothills like a prayer carved in stone. For 200 years, it had sheltered women from the world, noble women fleeing arranged marriages, widows seeking solace, girls offered to God before they could walk. The walls were thick, the gardens green, and the silence sacred. Sister Seraphina had lived there for 37 years. She remembered arriving as a girl of 12, her father's tears, her mother's stiff embrace. Now her hair was gray beneath her veil, her hands rough from tending herbs and copying manuscripts. She had transcribed the Gospels 4 times, each letter a prayer. Sister Liana was different. At 19, she was the youngest, a novice who still dreamed of the world beyond the walls. She had taken her vows only the previous spring, and sometimes Seraphina caught her staring at the mountains, wonder mixing with something like regret. Do you ever wish you had chosen differently? Seraphina asked her once. Liana smiled softly. Every day, and every day, I choose again. The abbot, Father Cyril, was an old man who walked with a staff carved from olive wood. He came from Constantinople decades ago, carrying books wrapped in silk. He taught the sisters to read Greek and Latin, to debate theology, to see God not as distant king but as the breath inside their lungs. It was Father Cyril who first heard the rumors. They came with the refugees, farmers fleeing north, merchants abandoning their caravans, soldiers who had deserted rather than face what was coming. They spoke of horrors that seemed impossible, tales too monstrous for daylight, cities swallowed by flames, pyramids built from skulls, rivers running red for days. The Mongols, they said, were not men but demons. They drank blood and ate human flesh. They worshipped the eternal sky and showed mercy to no one. Monks had been crucified on their own crosses, nuns taken as slaves and dragged across the steppes in chains. Exaggeration. Father Cyril said, though his hands shook as he blessed the evening meal, God will protect the faithful. But even he stopped believing his own words when the smoke appeared on the horizon. For 3 days, the sisters prepared. They buried their relics beneath the chapel floor, fragments of saint bones wrapped in silk, illuminated manuscripts bound in leather, the silver chalice that had held communion wine for 2 centuries. If their bodies were lost, their faith might still endure. They prayed without ceasing. The Psalms of David, the prayers of Mary, the ancient hymns that had survived since Rome fell. Their voices filled the chapel like incense, rising through cracks in the ceiling toward a sky that seemed to darken with each passing hour. Seraphina moved among them, touching each woman's shoulder, whispering words of comfort she no longer believed. She had seen the future in her dreams, fire and chains and silence that stretched forever. "We should flee," young Liana urged. "There are caves in the mountains. We could hide until they pass." "They will not pass," Seraphina replied. "They never pass. They only conquer." On the third night, they heard the drums, deep, rhythmic, relentless. The sound seemed to come from the earth itself, as if the world was announcing its own ending. Father Cyril locked the gates. The sisters gathered in the chapel, and they waited. The Mongols arrived with the sunrise. There were perhaps 200 riders, their horses small and swift, their armor made of lacquered leather that gleamed like beetle shells. They moved in perfect formation, a river of darkness flowing toward the monastery walls. They did not call for surrender. They did not offer terms. They simply attacked. The first wave came with fire arrows, streaking through the dawn like falling stars. The wooden roof of the scriptorium caught first, then the dormitories, then the granary where winter wheat was stored. Smoke rose in black columns that blotted out the sun. The gates held for perhaps an hour. Then the battering ram arrived, a massive trunk carried by 20 men, its tip wrapped in iron. Each impact shook the monastery to its foundations. Dust fell from the chapel ceiling. The icons trembled on the walls. When the gates finally splintered, the sisters were singing, "The Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world." Their voices trembled but never broke. The Mongols poured through like floodwater. They moved with brutal efficiency, soldiers who had done this 1,000 times before. They killed Father Cyril with a single arrow as he stood before the altar, arms spread wide as if to shield the cross itself. He fell without a sound, blood pooling beneath his robes. The warriors did not loot at first. They burned every manuscript, every icon, every scrap of parchment that bore the cross. They tore tapestries from the walls and fed them to the flames. They shattered the stained glass windows, grinding colored glass into dust beneath their boots. One soldier took the silver crucifix from Seraphina's hands. She tried to hold on, but he struck her across the face with the back of his hand. She fell, tasting blood, watching as he tossed the crucifix into a saddlebag like common coin. "Your God," he said in broken Greek, "is weak." But they were not searching for treasure. They were searching for symbols of defiance. And in the empire of the great Khan, nothing defied more loudly than women, who bowed to no earthly master. The surviving sisters, all 24, were herded into the courtyard as the monastery burned behind them. The smoke was so thick it turned day into twilight. Ash fell like snow, settling on their white veils, turning them gray. A Mongol commander approached. He was younger than Seraphina expected, perhaps 30, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He walked among the women slowly, studying each face as if memorizing them. "You are property of the Khan," he announced through a translator. "You will be recorded. You will be marked. You will be taken east to serve the empire." A scribe appeared with parchment and ink. He recorded each woman's name, her age, her place of birth. Every word will be entered into registers that still survive today, stained by wax and time. Then came the branding. They used a small iron, heated until it glowed red. The mark was simple, a single character in Mongol script that meant property. They pressed it into each woman's left shoulder, through the fabric of her habit, into flesh that would scar forever. Sister Liana screamed. Others fainted. Seraphina bit her lip until it bled, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her pain. That night, the steppes sang with a crackle of burning wood, and 24 women vanished into legend. They walked in chains. Not the heavy iron shackles of dungeon prisoners, but lighter bonds of woven horsehair rope that cut into wrists and ankles with every step. Each woman was tied to the one in front and behind, a human chain that stretched across the grasslands like a funeral procession. The Mongols rode beside them on their small, tireless horses. They did not speak to their captives. They barely looked at them. The sisters were cargo now, valuable but not human. The first day, they walked until their feet bled. The second day, they walked until they could no longer feel their feet. By the third day, they had learned to move in rhythm, matching each other's steps, supporting each other's weight. When one stumbled, Serafina walked at the front, Liana walked behind her. Neither spoke. Words seemed to have lost their meaning in this new world of dust and endless sky. The route east was marked by death. Corpses lined the road, refugees who had tried to flee, soldiers who had resisted, entire families who had chosen starvation over surrender. The Mongols left them where they fell, warnings carved in flesh. One morning, they passed through a village that had been prosperous once. Now it was ash and silence. The wells were poisoned with corpses. The fields were salted to ensure nothing would ever grow again. This was not conquest. This was erasure. Sister Liana began to weep, not for herself, but for the children whose toys still lay scattered in the ruins. Wooden dolls, clay whistles, things that would outlast the hands that made them. Do not look, Serafina whispered. Do not remember. It will only break you. But Liana kept looking. She needed to witness. Someone had to remember. On the seventh day, a young Mongol soldier approached them during the evening rest. He could not have been more than 16, his face still soft with youth. He carried a water skin. He offered it first to Serafina, then to each woman in turn. The water was cool and clean, drawn from a mountain stream. It tasted like mercy. When he reached Liana, he paused. She met his eyes the first time any Mongol had truly looked at her. For a moment, he was not a conqueror and she was not a captive. They were simply two young people caught in history's grinding wheels. Liana whispered a blessing in Latin. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He bowed his head slightly, then turned and walked away. He was gone the next morning, transferred to a different unit. The sisters never saw him again. But Liana held on to that moment, proof that even in darkness, something human could still flicker. At night, they prayed in whispers. The Mongols did not stop them, perhaps because they did not fear prayers to foreign gods. What could words do against an empire? But the prayers sustained them more than food. Each recitation was a thread connecting them to who they had been. Without prayer, they were simply women walking toward oblivion. With prayer, they were still servants of something eternal. The steppes were vast beyond comprehension. The sky stretched from horizon to horizon, empty of everything except stars that seemed close enough to touch. The wind never stopped, carrying scents of distant fires and unknown flowers. Sister Liana began to understand why the Mongols worshipped the sky. Here, beneath such immensity, human concerns seemed absurd. Kings and kingdoms, prayers and temples, all of it was dust beneath infinite blue. But she still prayed, because if God was anywhere, he was in that vastness. And if he heard her, she was not alone. After 23 days of walking, they reached the Mongol encampment. It was a city of felt and smoke, thousands of circular tents called gurs, arranged in perfect geometric patterns, each one housing a family, a clan, a piece of the Great Migration. The noise was overwhelming after weeks of silence. Children shouting, horses neighing, smiths hammering metal, women singing in throaty voices that rose and fell like wind. Smoke from cooking fires hung in the air, carrying the smell of mutton and fermented mare's milk. The sisters were paraded through the main avenue. People stopped to stare. Christian nuns were rare, even in an empire built on conquest. Some pointed and laughed. Others made warning signs, as if holiness itself was contagious. They were brought before a council of commanders, men whose faces were weathered like old leather, whose eyes held the blank certainty of those who had killed so often. It no longer registered as sin. Through a translator, the offer was made: renounce your foreign god. Accept the eternal blue sky as master. You will be given new names, new lives, new purposes within the empire. The silence stretched. 24 women, exhausted and starving, stood before power absolute. Sister Seraphina stepped forward. Her voice was hoarse but clear. We have already given our lives. What else can you take? The commander smiled. Not cruelly, but with something like pity. Everything, he said. We can take everything. That night, they learned what he meant. Karakorum rose from the steppes like a fever dream. It was a city of contradictions, felt tents beside stone palaces, Buddhist temples next to Islamic mosques, merchants from Venice trading with envoys from Cathay. The empire of the Mongols was not a culture, but a collection. Trophies gathered from every conquest. The Khan's palace dominated the city center. Its walls were covered in glazed tiles that shimmered like dragon scales. The doors were plated in gold. Inside, the floors were heated by underground fires. A Persian innovation that made even winter comfortable. The sisters were taken to the lower levels, away from the courtyards where nobles gathered. Their habits were stripped away and replaced with rough tunics made of coarse wool. Their hair, which they had kept covered for years, was shorn short. They were no longer nuns, they were slaves. 3 days after their arrival, they were brought before the Khan's chief minister, a man named Yelu Chukai. He was not Mongol but Chinese, a scholar who served the empire with elegant pragmatism. He spoke 7 languages and collected poetry. He was also responsible for administering the Khan's vast slave population. He studied the women with clinical interest, the way a physician might examine a patient. You are educated, he observed, literate in Latin and Greek, skilled in medicine and herb lore. The empire has used for such talents. He paused, letting his words settle. But first, you must demonstrate loyalty. Renounce your carpenter god. Acknowledge that the eternal blue sky rules all. This is not a negotiation. This is mercy. Sister Seraphina met his gaze without flinching. We answer to a higher king. Yelu Chukai sighed, as if disappointed by a student who had failed a simple test. There is no higher king. There is only the Khan. And the Khan's will shapes reality itself. He gestured to the guards. Take them below. Let hunger teach what words cannot. They were given 1 meal a day, barley gruel and stale bread, barely enough to sustain life. The cold was constant, seeping up from the stone floors, settling into bones. At night, they huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the darkness. But Seraphina refused to break. Each morning, she led prayers. Each evening, she recited scripture from memory, entire chapters of the Gospels, psalms learned as a child, hymns that had survived since Constantine's Rome. The guards began to fear her, not because she threatened them, but because her certainty never wavered. They beat her and she prayed. They starved her and she sang. They could control her body, but not her soul. One guard, a man named Batu, who spoke broken Greek, tried to understand. Why do you suffer for a dead man? He asked. He is not dead, Seraphina replied. Death could not hold him. Then where is he now? Why does he not save you? Seraphina smiled, blood on her lips from a split that would not heal. He already did. Not all the sisters shared Seraphina's strength. Sister Maria, who had been a noblewoman before taking vows, broke first. She agreed to conversion, desperate for the promise of comfort. They dressed her in silk and took her away. The others never saw her again. Then Sister Helena, then two women from Antioch whose names no one remembered because they had taken vows of silence years before. Each disappearance hardened the resolve of those who remained. They were not angry at the women who broke, they understood. But they also understood that every conversion was a small victory for erasure. Sister Liana carved marks into the stone wall of their cell, one for each day, one for each lost sister. The marks formed patterns, a calendar of sorrow that would outlast them all. The palace servants began to talk. Stories spread through the kitchens and laundry rooms, whispered between women who emptied chamber pots and scrubbed floors. They spoke of the silent sisters, foreign women who refused to bow. Some said they were cursed, possessed by demons. Others said they were saints, touched by a god so powerful even the Khan feared him. One old woman, a Nestorian Christian who had served the palace for 30 years, smuggled bread to them. She could not free them, but she could witness. And in witnessing, she kept their story alive. "Do not surrender," she whispered through the cell door. "The world is watching." But the world was not watching. The world had forgotten them already. Deep in the palace, in rooms where the Khan's wives and concubines lived, a rumor took hold. At night, when the palace slept, faint voices could be heard rising from the stones. Women singing in a language no one recognized, praising a god no one could name. Some claimed it was ghosts. Others said it was magic, a spell the Christian women had woven to curse their captors. The truth was simpler. It was faith refusing to die. And in the echoing halls where kings feasted on delicacies from across the empire, the sound of prayer still rose through the stones, soft as breath, unstoppable as dawn. Time lost meaning in the darkness. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The sisters worked from dawn until their hands bled, washing linens, polishing brass, tending fires that warmed chambers they would never see. They were forbidden to speak except when answering direct questions. Silence became their second language, more fluent than Latin or Greek. Their names were taken. Each woman was given a number, marked on the wooden tablet hung around her neck. Sister Seraphina became number 7. Sister Liana became number 22. But at night, when the guards changed shifts, they whispered their true names to each other. Seraphina, Liana, Maria who was lost, Helena who surrendered. Memory became resistance. Without prayer books or crucifixes, they created new rituals. They traced crosses in the dust beneath their straw mattresses. They divided their meager food into 12 portions, echoing the Last Supper. They measured time not by days but by the rhythm of the call to prayer from the distant mosque 5 times daily, a clock that never stopped. Sister Liana discovered that if she positioned herself near the eastern wall at dawn, a thin beam of sunlight would pierce through a crack in the stone. For perhaps 30 seconds, light would illuminate her face. She began to time her prayers to that moment, greeting the sun as if it were God's own hand reaching down. The other sisters noticed and joined her. 30 seconds of light became their Eucharist, more sacred than any ceremony they had known in the monastery. One night, Liana began to carve. Using a shard of broken pottery, she scratched into the stone wall, working so slowly and quietly the guards never noticed. First, a cross. Then words in Latin, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in darkness. But she could not stop there. She began to document everything. Names, dates, prayers, the pattern of guards, the taste of the gruel, the sound of wind through the ventilation shaft. She became their chronicler, preserving in stone what the empire wanted to erase. The other sisters watched and wept, not from sorrow, but from gratitude. Even if they died forgotten, the walls would remember. Yelu Chukai returned, this time accompanied by scholars, a Buddhist monk from Tibet, a Muslim imam from Samarkand, a Nestorian priest from Persia. They were learned men who spoke gently, treating theology like a philosophical puzzle. Your God and ours are not enemies, the imam argued. We all worship the one creator, only the names differ. Then why do you insist we abandon his name? Serafina replied. The Buddhist monk tried a different approach. Attachment causes suffering. Release your grip on this one truth and find peace. We have found peace, Liana said quietly. It is you who seem troubled by our choice. The Nestorian priest, who should have been an ally, proved the cruelest. I too am Christian, he said, but I have learned to serve both Christ and Khan. Why can you not do the same? Because, Serafina whispered, Christ does not share his throne. The scholars left, shaking their heads. These women were not ignorant peasants who could be dazzled by rhetoric. They were educated, articulate, and absolutely certain. Such certainty was dangerous to any empire. After 6 months of captivity, 2 more sisters broke. They were twins from Corfu, girls who had taken vows together at age 16. They could not bear to watch each other starve. They recited the words of conversion. They accepted new names, Turakina and Sorgatani, after Mongol princesses. They were dressed in silk and taken to different parts of the palace. The other sisters never learned their fate. Perhaps they lived in comfort. Perhaps they died of shame. Perhaps they found a way to hold both faith and survival in the same heart. But their departure left only 14 sisters alive, 14 ghosts in rags, growing thinner and paler with each passing day. Sister Dieris, who had been silent throughout their captivity, finally spoke. She was the oldest after Serafina, perhaps 60 years old. Her body bent from decades of manual labor. I have watched empires rise and fall, she said, her voice like wind through dead leaves. Rome, Byzantium, the Caliphate, all believe themselves eternal. All are dust. She looked at each remaining sister. They want us to speak their words. Let us give them silence instead. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of stone. Let them break themselves against our stillness. From that moment, none of them spoke to their captors again. When questioned, they answered only with closed lips. When threatened, they stared forward without blinking. When struck, they did not cry out. The guards called them the Stone Sisters. They meant it as mockery, but the name became prophecy. Official records mentioned them only in passing. Foreign captives, unresponsive, unproductive. To the Mongols, they were failed conversions. To history, they became something else. Living proof that faith could survive where walls and chains could not. By the time spring returned to the palace gardens above, only 11 of the original 24 were still alive. The guards called them ghosts in rags. But the servants whispered of something stranger, that sometimes, deep in the night, faint voices could be heard beneath the palace, chanting in a language no one remembered but everyone feared. It was the same hymn they had sung as their monastery burned, and within those forgotten corridors where no sunlight reached, the survivors found something unexpected. Sister Liana discovered it by accident. While scrubbing the floor of a storage chamber, her hand found a gap between stones. Cold air flowed through it, carrying the scent of something ancient old earth and older prayers. She worked at the stones for 3 nights, prying them loose with her broken pottery shard, widening the gap inch by inch. On the 4th night, she slipped through. The chamber beyond was small, perhaps 10 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness. It had been sealed for decades. maybe centuries. Cobwebs thick as cloth hung from the corners. The air was still, but on the far wall, carved deep into the stone, was a cross. This place had been holy once. Perhaps during the brief years when Nestorian Christianity had flourished in the Mongol court. Perhaps earlier when the Silk Road traders brought their god east in caravans. The chamber remembered what the empire had tried to forget. Liana returned through the gap, trembling with discovery. That night, she told the others in whispers, "We have a sanctuary." They worked in shifts, one woman at a time slipping through the gap, bringing whatever they could find. A scrap of linen became an altar cloth. Broken pottery became candle holders. They stole a small amount of mutton fat from the kitchens and twisted it with thread to make crude candles that guttered and smoked but gave light. From a shard of a shattered mirror, Sister Seraphina fashioned a crude cross. She wrapped it in threads pulled from her own garment until it shone with makeshift glory. The chamber became their chapel, hidden in the palace foundations like a secret heart still beating. They gathered there each night after the palace slept, crawling through the gap one by one, 11 women who had become shadows. In that sacred darkness, they prayed not the whispered prayers of captives, but full-voiced worship that echoed off the stones. No hymns, no sermons, only memories shared in whispers. Each woman knelt and spoke of home, the sound of church bells, the warmth of bread before dawn, the way spring came to the valleys with wildflowers and birdsong. These memories became their new psalms, small offerings to a God who still listened in the dark. Sister Liana continued her chronicle on the chapel walls. Using charcoal from the candles, she drew symbols that told their story. A bird for each sister still alive, a small flame for those who had been lost, a cross for faith that endured, a crown for the God they served. Each night, she updated the count. When a new bird failed to appear, it meant another had disappeared, taken by illness, starvation, or the empire's slow dissolution of the soul. The guards never found the chapel, but they began to notice something strange. Despite the hunger, the cold, the endless captivity, the women moved with a quiet, almost unnatural calm. They smiled at nothing. They sang while they worked, barely audible, but constant. The overseers labeled it madness, but the scribes observing them recorded something else entirely. They have discovered a strength not of this world. It was Sister Deiris who sensed the end approaching. She woke one morning unable to rise, her body finally surrendering after months of starvation. The other sisters gathered around her in the chapel, holding her hands, singing softly. "I will see him soon," she whispered. "Tell me, do you think he will recognize us? We have become so small." "He has always known the small," Seraphina replied. "The mustard seed, the lost coin, the one sparrow fallen." Deiris smiled and closed her eyes. Her breath slowed, then stopped. They buried her in the chamber itself, covering her body with stones, making her part of the foundation. After that, the deaths came quickly. Hunger and cold took Sister Magdalena. Fever took the twins from Armenia. Sister Irene simply lay down one night and did not wake. By winter's end, only 3 remained: Seraphina, Liana, and a woman named Theodora, who had not spoken since the monastery burned. They knew their time was short, but they also knew they had won. Not survival. Survival was not the victory they sought. They had won something more important. They had refused to be forgotten. The last entry in Yellow Trukai's register is dated March 1242. It reads simply, "Foreign captives, unfit for service, disposed. No burial records, no documentation of death, just a gap in the ledger where 24 names should have been." This was how history erased them, not with fire, but with withheld ink. Only something shameful is hidden so carefully. But centuries later, an Ottoman courtier's diary surfaced in the archives of Bursa, cryptically mentioning foreign women in the Mongol court who refused to bow and disappeared beneath the palace foundations. Another letter, intercepted by Venetian spies in 1284, spoke of nuns who would not submit to the Khan's will. Together, these fragments reveal the truth the empire had tried to bury, the deliberate erasure of women who had become spiritual symbols of resistance. In 1967, Soviet archaeologists excavating the ruins of Karakorum made an unexpected discovery. Beneath layers of collapsed stone and centuries of earth, they found a small sealed chamber. Inside were crude candles, scraps of cloth, and walls covered in carvings, Latin phrases, Christian symbols, names scratched in shaking hands, and one line repeated over and over, carved so deep it seemed to throb with life. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in darkness. That discovery changed everything. It proved these women had not simply vanished. They had left a mark, a silent revolt etched into the walls. They had created beauty in hell and worship in the void. DNA testing on the bones found in the chamber confirmed they belonged to multiple individuals, all female, all showing signs of prolonged malnutrition. Carbon dating placed their deaths in the mid-13th century, exactly when the monastery sisters would have been captive. The Mongol Empire had tried to erase them. Instead, it became their monument. The chapel lies in ruins now, preserved behind glass at the Karakorum archaeological site. Visitors from around the world come to stand before those walls, reading prayers in languages they do not speak, honoring courage they can barely comprehend. Sister Seraphina's name appears on a memorial in Thessaloniki, alongside the other saints of the Mongol persecution. Sister Liana is remembered at Oxford, where scholars study the theological writings she left carved in stone. But their greatest memorial is not in museums or universities. It is in the simple fact that we remember them at all. The Mongols conquered more territory than any empire in history. They destroyed kingdoms, erased cultures, and rewrote the map of the world. But they could not silence faith. They could not break women who had already surrendered everything. In their silence, the Stone Sisters spoke louder than any conqueror. A Venetian merchant, writing in 1290, recorded a story he heard in Karakorum. On certain full moon nights, he wrote, "The ruins of the old palace grow cold, and the air smells faintly of incense, though no fire burns. And if you press your ear to the foundation stones, you can hear it, women's voices, singing in Latin, refusing to die. Memory, superstition, or both, it doesn't matter. Because the truth is carved in stone. They were meant to be forgotten. Instead, they became eternal. If their story reached you tonight, let it stay with you. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you felt when you learned what they endured. And if you want more untold stories buried in the shadows of history, subscribe and step deeper into the past with us. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how much time tries to erase them. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness has never overcome it. But the story does not end in the ruins of Karakorum, because in 2003, a discovery in the Vatican archives revealed something extraordinary, something that would force historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the Stone Sisters. Father Marco Benedetti, a Jesuit historian cataloging medieval manuscripts, found it tucked inside a larger volume of papal correspondence. A single sheet of parchment, water-stained and fragile, written in Latin so precise, it could only have been composed by someone classically educated. The date at the top read, Anno Domini 1241, the year of the sisters' captivity. The letter had no signature, only a closing phrase. written in darkness by one who still sees light. Father Benedetti's hands shook as he read. The letter described, in haunting detail, the interior of a Mongol palace, the conditions of captivity, the systematic attempts at conversion. But more than that, it contained something unprecedented, a first-hand theological reflection on suffering written from the depths of persecution itself. We have learned, the letter read, that God does not prevent our suffering. He enters into it. We thought we came here to guard our vows. We were wrong. We came here to discover that vows are not walls we build around ourselves, but windows through which God reaches into the world's darkest places. The document was authenticated by 3 separate laboratories. The ink dated to the 13th century. The parchment originated in Central Asia. The Latin matched the grammatical patterns of educated Greek speakers of that era. Someone had written from inside the Mongol court. And somehow, impossibly, the letter had reached Rome. Further investigation revealed how, cross-referencing the letter's arrival date with Venetian trade records, historians traced a possible from Karakorum to Samarkand, carried by a merchant caravan, from Samarkand to Trebizond on the Black Sea, hidden among spice shipments, from Trebizond to Venice by ship, and finally from Venice to Rome by papal courier. The journey would have taken 2 years. The letter reached the Vatican in 1243, long after its author was likely dead. But someone along that chain, perhaps a sympathetic merchant, perhaps a fellow Christian slave, perhaps the old Nestorian woman who smuggled them bread, had recognized the document's importance and risked everything to preserve it. A Venetian merchant's ledger from 1242, discovered in the Archivio di Stato, contains a cryptic entry. Received sacred writings from Eastern correspondent. Payment 40 ducats. Delivered to Rome as directed by conscience. 40 ducats was a fortune enough to buy a small house. Someone had paid dearly to ensure that letter survived. The full letter, now preserved under glass in the Vatican secret archives, contains passages that read like scripture written in hell. They ask us daily, "Where's your God?" We answer, "Here, in this hunger that teaches us we do not live by bread alone. In this darkness that shows us light is not the sun but something deeper. In these chains that prove we were never as free as we believed when we walked unchained. We thought we knew God in the monastery. We were children then, playing at devotion. We thought suffering was fasting through Lent or kneeling on cold stone floors. We knew nothing. Here, we have learned that God is not beautiful. Beauty is what we see from a distance. God is what remains when beauty is stripped away, the love that survives when there is no reason left to love, the hope that endures when hope itself seems like madness. If we die here, let it be known, we did not die for refusing to speak new words. We died for refusing to forget old ones. And there is glory in that, the glory of a seed that falls into the ground and dies, that it might bear fruit in a season we will never see. The letter contains practical details too, descriptions of the palace architecture, the names of guards, the daily rations. These details allowed historians to confirm that the author had indeed been captive in the exact location described in Mongol administrative records. But it is the theology that haunts readers. This is not the sanitized faith of someone who has read about suffering. This is faith forged in the furnace, every word earned through darkness. In 2011, another fragment surfaced, this time in the archives of the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul. It was written in Greek with Armenian annotations, suggesting it had passed through multiple hands. The handwriting was different from the first letter, shakier, the letters poorly formed, but the content was unmistakable. Another testimony from inside the Mongol palace. This one was signed Theodora, unworthy servant of Christ. Sister Theodora, the woman, who had not spoken since the monastery burned. She had found her voice again, not in speech, but in writing. Her letter was shorter, more fragmented, as if written in stolen moments. Serafina is gone. Fever took her last week. Before she died, she made us promise to record everything. Silence protects us in this life, she said, but silence in the next would be sin. Someone must tell what happened here. So I write, though my hand shakes and the candle gutters. We are 3 now. Myself, Liana, and one other, whose name I dare not commit to paper lest this letter be intercepted. They think we have broken because we no longer resist. They are wrong. We have learned a deeper resistance, the resistance of water against stone. We do not fight the empire. We simply refuse to become part of it. Every day, they give us new tasks. We perform them perfectly. They give us new lessons in their language. We learn eagerly. They offer us better quarters if we will convert. We smile and decline. We have become invisible to them, too compliant to punish, too stubborn to trust. And in our invisibility, we have found freedom. Last night, in the hidden chapel, we carved one final message into the wall. Not our names, those belong to God now, but a single word in Latin that contains everything. Surrexit, he is risen. If this letter reaches anyone, know this. We do not ask to be rescued. We do not ask to be remembered. We ask only that you do what we have done, hold fast to truth in a world that calls truth madness, and love in a world that calls love weakness. And if you stand one day where we stood, in darkness so complete, you cannot see your own hand. Remember, the eye adjusts. Given time, even darkness becomes visible. And in that visibility, you will find you are not alone. The letter ends abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. But those final words have been translated into 17 languages and inscribed on monuments from Athens to Jerusalem. The third and final letter was found by accident in 2019. A graduate student at Cambridge, researching Silk Road trade routes, was examining a 13th century merchant's diary when she noticed something odd. Certain pages had been carefully cut out and replaced with different parchment. Using spectral imaging, conservators discovered that the replacement pages contained text written in invisible ink, a mixture of lemon juice and saliva that had faded to nothing over centuries, but could still be read under ultraviolet light. The hidden text was a list, 107 names, each with a brief description. Serafina of Thessaly teacher, keeper of faith, died 1241. Fever. Liana of Anatolia scribe, keeper of memory, died 1242. Starvation. Theodora the silent prophet, keeper of hope, died 1242. Cause unknown. The list continued. Names of women from across the Christian world, all captured by the Mongols in various campaigns, all imprisoned in various locations. The monastery sisters were not alone. There had been others, hundreds of others. The document's author identified himself only as Brother Thomas Franciscan, witness to the dying. His accompanying note explained, I came to Karakorum in 1241 with the papal embassy, tasked with converting the Khan to Christianity. I failed in that mission but succeeded in another. I documented the names of every Christian captive I could find, that they might not vanish entirely from history. Many have died, more will die, but their names will outlive the empire that killed them. This I vow before God. Brother Thomas's diary records that he was expelled from the Mongol court in 1243 for seditious activity, the crime of recording names the empire wanted erased. He made it as far as Samarkand before dying of dysentery. The merchant who purchased his belongings found the diary and, recognizing its importance, preserved it. 7 centuries later, that merchant's decision means we know not just the monastery sister's story, but the stories of dozens of others. Greek Orthodox nuns from Kiev, Coptic women from Egypt, Nestorian Christians from Persia, even a few Catholic pilgrims captured on the roads to Jerusalem. Each name in Brother Thomas's list represents a story the world will never fully know. But the fact that we know they existed at all is a small miracle proof that even empires built on forgetting can be defeated by memory. Modern excavations have confirmed details from all three letters: the hidden chapel, the carved symbols, the crude altar. But archaeologists have found something else too: evidence of a network. Scratched into stones throughout the palace complex are tiny symbols, crosses so small they could be mistaken for cracks. Fish symbols hidden in decorative patterns, even letters of the Greek alphabet incorporated into Mongol designs where builders assumed no one would notice. Dr. Elena Dmitrievna, lead archaeologist at the Karakorum site, believes these marks represent a secret communication system between Christian captives spread throughout the palace. They couldn't speak to each other openly, she explains, but they could leave messages in stone. A cross here might mean someone is watching. A fish symbol might mean safe to gather tonight. They created an entire language of survival that has outlasted the empire they defied. In Buzz 2021, ground-penetrating radar revealed another chamber beneath the palace larger than the chapel, with evidence of multiple occupants over many years. Preliminary excavations found bones, pottery, and one artifact that made international headlines: a small wooden cross no bigger than the thumb, with a hollow interior. Inside the hollow was a tightly rolled piece of parchment, miraculously preserved by the dry conditions. It contained a single prayer written in Greek: "Lord, we are lost to the world, but not to you. Remember us when we are forgotten. Speak for us when we are silenced. And when the darkness claims our bodies, let our faith become light for those who come after." No name, no date. Just a prayer cast into the future like a message in a bottle, hoping that someday someone would find it and remember. We found it, we remember. Today, the Stone Sisters are commemorated on October 29th by Orthodox and Catholic churches alike. Pope Francis, during a 2018 visit to Mongolia, knelt at the site of their chapel and prayed in Latin, the same language they had prayed in 7 centuries before. These women, he said, teach us that martyrdom is not always blood. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is the daily choice to remain who you are when the world demands you become someone else. The Mongolian government has designated the chapel site a protected heritage zone. A small museum now stands nearby, displaying artifacts from the excavation: pottery shards, bone fragments, the charcoal stubs of ancient candles, and the walls themselves, still bearing the prayers carved by hands that have long since turned to dust. But perhaps the most moving memorial is not in Mongolia at all. It is in a small chapel in Thessaloniki, where Sister Seraphina was born. Local believers maintain a perpetual flame there, a candle that has burned continuously since 1242, lit by the bishop the year news of the monastery's destruction reached Greece. For 780 years, through wars and earthquakes, occupations and revolutions, someone has kept that flame alive. When the Ottomans conquered Thessaloniki, a Christian woman hid the candle in her basement. When the Nazis occupied the city, an Orthodox priest smuggled it to safety. When communism fell and religious practice resumed, the candle was carried back to its chapel in a procession of thousands. We light candles for the dead, explains Father Alexios, current keeper of the flame. But this candle is different. This candle means they are not dead. Their faith burns on, and as long as we remember, they live. In 2023, A team of linguists and audio engineers attempted something unprecedented. Using the dimensions of the hidden chapel and the density of the stone, they created a computer model that could reproduce the acoustic properties of that underground chamber. Then they hired a women's choir to sing the Agnus Dei, the same hymn the sisters sang as their monastery burned, and processed the recording through the acoustic model. The result was haunting. The stone walls created echoes that lasted for seconds, layering voice upon voice until individual words became indistinguishable from each other. The effect was not cacophony but harmony, as if the room itself was singing, as if the prayers had seeped into the stones and were still resonating centuries later. What struck me most, said Dr. Sarah Whitmore, lead acoustician on the project, was how the echo pattern created moments of perfect silence between phrases. It forced you to listen, to wait, to meditate on what had been sung. This wasn't just a place of worship. It was a place designed for contemplation in darkness. They had transformed their prison into a cathedral. The recording has been played more than 2 million times online. Listeners report feeling overwhelming emotion. Some describe it as grief, others as hope, many as both at once. Several people have written that they heard the recording during their own darkest moments and found in it the strength to endure. I was in a hospital room. One comment reads, listening to doctors tell me there was no hope left. Then this recording came on randomly. I don't even know how. I'm not religious. But hearing those voices from 800 years ago, still singing in the darkness, still refusing to be silent, it changed something in me. If they could hold on, maybe I could too. The Sisters' Chapel has become, improbably, a place of pilgrimage for people of all faiths and none. They come not to worship, but to witness, to stand where faith refused to die and to carry that refusal back into their own lives. But there is one mystery that has never been solved. One question that haunts every historian who studies the Stone Sisters: how did the letters get out? Mongol palace security was legendary. Every person entering or leaving was searched, every package inspected, every visitor recorded. The idea that multiple letters written by captive women under constant surveillance could have been smuggled out and sent thousands of miles to Europe seems impossible. Yet it happened. Dr. James Morrison, who has studied the letters for 20 years, has a theory. There must have been a network. Not just one sympathetic person, but many, operating across the Silk Road. Merchants, translators, soldiers, servants, people who believe that some stories are too important to let die. These weren't grand conspirators. They were ordinary people who saw injustice and, in small ways, resisted. One person hid a letter in a spice shipment. Another carried it to the next city. Another paid a courier. Another delivered it to the Venetian embassy. Dozens of people, most of whose names we'll never know, risking punishment to ensure that 3 women's voices reached Rome. That's the real miracle. Not that the sisters survived, they didn't, but that strangers cared enough to make them remembered. That's faith too. Faith in the power of testimony. Faith that truth matters even when it's costly. Recent discoveries support this theory. Letters found in various archives across the Silk Road from Samarkand to Trebizond contain brief mentions of sacred writings or documents from holy women being passed along trade routes. One letter, from a Genoese merchant to his brother, is explicit. I have been entrusted with the most dangerous cargo, not silk or spices, but words that could cost me my head if discovered. But I think of my own sister, and I wonder, if she were captive in a foreign land, would I want someone to carry her voice home? So I carry these voices, and I pray the council inspectors do not search too carefully. That merchant's name was Leonardo Grimaldi. He made it safely to Constantinople, where he delivered his cargo to the Venetian embassy. 6 months later, he died in a riding accident. Some historians believe it was no accident at all that the Mongols had discovered his role and arranged his death. But by then, the letters were already in Rome, already being copied, already entering the historical record where no empire could erase them. Leonardo Grimaldi has no grave, no memorial. But every time someone reads the sisters' letters, his courage lives again. There is one more letter. No one has found it yet. But historians believe it must exist. The logic is simple. 3 letters survived, written at different times by different women. The first described their initial captivity. The second described their resistance. The third recorded their names. But none of them described the end. All 3 letters were written while the authors were still alive, still enduring. There should be a 4th letter, one written by someone who witnessed their final days, who knew how the story ended. Brother Thomas's diary mentions that he left Karakorum with final testimonies in his possession. But after his death in Samarkand, his belongings were scattered. Most have been recovered. But some merchants' records suggest that one package described only as sealed writings, sacred, was sent not west to Europe but south to India. There was a small Christian community in southern India at the time, descendants of converts who traced their faith back to the Apostle Thomas. If Brother Thomas sent something there for safekeeping, it might still exist, preserved in some monastery archive that has never been fully cataloged. Dr. Sarah Chen, who specializes in Indian Christian history, is currently investigating. We have records of a package arriving from Central Asia in 1244 at a church in Kerala. The records describe it as testimonies of the faithful who suffered under the Khan. The package was placed in the church's repository, and that's where the trail goes cold. That church still exists. Its archives have never been fully examined. There could be hundreds of documents down there, untouched for centuries. If the 4th letter is anywhere, it's there. A team is being assembled for 2025. The church has granted permission to search. And somewhere in the darkness of those archives, the final chapter of the Stone Sisters story may be waiting.